All right, so our fourth and final installment here of the Vietnam War saga. Key terms, again, pause, make sure you can do these things here: describe, analyze, assess, evaluate. As a presidential candidate, Richard Nixon promised peace and honor, peace with honor, and an end to the war that had fractured American society. Nixon did indeed withdraw American troops, and the Vietnam War finally ended, but the impact of the war endured. As the nation recovered from war, Americans re-examined the struggle against communism, the power of the presidency, and America's role in the world. And this is an image of Nixon meeting with his defense team in 1971. Here's something to emphasize here. He says peace with honor. He doesn't say victory. We're going to find a way to leave this conflict, and we're going to find a way to do it honorably. This is no longer a situation where the president is promising an easy or clear victory, because there is no path to an all-out victory here at this point in the war. We're too bogged down. It's too much of a quagmire. We're losing people. Right? We don't want to commit ourselves as a nation to a drawn-out period of indeterminate warfare. Nixon's going to inherit two things from Johnson: an unpopular war and a vocal American opposition to it. The new president wanted peace with honor, security for America's ally, South Vietnam, and international respect for U.S. foreign policy. Anti-war activists wanted to end the war, and they wanted to bring American troops out of Vietnam on any terms, whether or not South Vietnam was safe, whether or not we were embarrassed in front of the world, whether or not we felt it was honorable. Nixon found it increasingly difficult to achieve his goals and satisfy the anti-war movement, which is growing increasingly vocal. So here's how quickly public opinion changed. So who has opposition to the war in April of 1968 versus April of 1959? And you can see that number jumps from 32% to 58% in a year, just a little over a year. So you can see how quickly things change. And this is an image of a young kid. This is in Kent State, the Kent State Massacre, as it's oftentimes known, when the National Guard opens fire on a group of peaceful protesters. The anti-war movement was a very real thing in the United States during the 60s. It's uprisings. I don't want to use the word uprising, especially because that word is so charged these days. A rising up of peaceful people who want peace at all costs in this country. They are incredibly vocal. They're building on the momentum of the civil rights protests, and of course they're asking for a call to action in a different way. But we're going to listen to some music also associated with this movement. But they are oftentimes met with violence from the state, and this is one example. Vietnam is such a unique problem for Nixon, and he really has to tap dance his way out of it. So Richard Nixon, obviously a failed president who resigns in disgrace from the office, correct? He is a criminal who did illegal activities, and I am in no way, shape, or form defending him. But as a president, if we just look at his actions, he really did some very interesting things. And I think had he, not broken the law when it came to politics and his political ambitions and his paranoia, he would have had a much different legacy. One of probably the more controversial parts of his legacy is his appointment of a man named Henry Kissinger as Special Assistant for National Security Affairs. Henry Kissinger is oftentimes criticized and sometimes even gone so far as to be called a war criminal for his actions and lack of action in Vietnam. His goal is to calm relations between China and the USSR, and he's going to engage in secret talks also with the North Vietnamese. Nixon's official policy towards Vietnam was called Vietnamization. It's a mouthful, Vietnamization. It means that the United States would withdraw troops and begin to better train the South Vietnamese to take on a larger role while continuing to bomb from the air, to provide air support. We use this model. We've used this model in Afghanistan and other places, Iraq, where we go in, we participate in the initial warfare, and then we train the people on the ground, the local people, to sort of take our place, and then we leave. It's unsuccessful here in Vietnam, and it has been met with mixed success thereafter. You have an event called the My Lai Massacre, where a group of American soldiers massacre a village of Vietnamese civilians, women and children, and the elderly. It is a horrible, disgusting war crime, and it continues this public cry to leave Vietnam immediately. But at the same time as Nixon is, implementing this policy of Vietnamization, you can also say he's expanding the war because he starts to bomb Cambodia, invade Cambodia. In December of 1970, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is repealed. So essentially, the president does not have the broad authority that he once did to commit resources to Vietnam. And you also have the publication of the Pentagon Papers. I'm going to play a short video on what the Pentagon Papers are.
Sunday, June 13th, 1971, the New York Times published a report that would change history. Their source was Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst working for the government, and the report, which would soon become known as the Pentagon Papers, included top-secret and incriminating information about the Vietnam War. Between 1967 and 1969, Ellsberg worked on a classified project for the government called United States-Vietnam Relations, 1945-1967, a study prepared by the Department of Defense. The Pentagon Papers were not a good look for the United States government. Ellsberg research showed that there were many military miscalculations and even flat-out lies told by politicians about U.S. involvement in Vietnam. But why did Ellsberg decide to leak the papers to the New York Times? While working on the project, he realized he no longer supported the Vietnam War and thought it was unwinnable. In October of 1969, concerned that the public was being lied to, he began photocopying the report. He leaked some documents to members of Congress, but none of them went public. So in 1970, Ellsberg leaked portions to the New York Times and the Washington Post. The Pentagon Papers revealed that the government had been involved in Vietnam through several presidencies, unbeknownst to the American people. As early as 1950, the Truman administration gave military aid to France against the Viet Minh. In 1954, President Eisenhower sent aircraft and military assistance to Vietnam. By that time, the U.S. was covering 80% of France's military expenses in Indochina. President Kennedy adopted a policy of broad commitment to the war in Vietnam, even though the American people had been told U.S. involvement would be very limited. Then, President Lyndon B. Johnson waged military operations against North Vietnam. He began planning war in 1964, a full year before the depth of U.S. involvement was revealed to the public. In 1971, when the New York Times broke the story, President Nixon quickly obtained a court injunction from a federal judge in New York, stopping the Times from printing any more articles. He argued that publishing the Pentagon Papers would limit the president's ability to guard national security. The Times adhered to the restraining order, but they filed an appeal. Meanwhile, Katharine Graham, head of the Washington Post, started publishing articles about the Pentagon Papers instead. Nixon tried to stop the Post as well, but unlike the judge in New York, the D.C. judge refused to issue an injunction. This allowed the Post to continue publishing about the secret report. The inconsistency between the Post and Times cases quickly brought both papers to trial in the Supreme Court. The court decided that under the freedom of press, the government did not have a strong enough case to censor the press. Nixon lost the fight, and the articles were printed. Ellsberg was still indicted under the Espionage Act for leaking government secrets. He could have been sentenced to 115 years in prison, but the charges were dropped after evidence of governmental misconduct came to light. Although the Pentagon Papers did not include any details on Nixon's conduct in Vietnam, the president was embarrassed by the publications. He subsequently sought to discredit Ellsberg by using a team he called plumbers. They broke into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to try to uncover embarrassing or harmful information that might make Ellsberg look bad. This was the same group of burglars who'd become famous for their role in the Watergate scandal. It didn't work. Ellsberg was free, and together with the New York Times, set a new precedent for the press, a responsibility to tell the truth, even if it means publishing classified documents.
Okay, so what's that? In case it starts talking again. So the Pentagon Papers are a really interesting moment in media history and in U.S. history, obviously, as well, and reveal that although Johnson had been saying we're almost winning, we're about to win, hang tight, we're going to win, privately that the government was extremely well aware that this was an unwinnable situation. And so the question is, why are we sending our children, our husbands, our friends overseas to fight in an unwinnable war? The failings of Vietnamization and growing dissent at home forced President Nixon to search for some final way out of the conflict. A 1971 public opinion poll revealed that 2/3 of Americans favored withdrawing American troops, even if it meant a communist takeover of South Vietnam. Sensitive to the public mood, Congress pressed Nixon to bring troops home. Many believed that to win re-election in 1972, he had to end the war. Again, though, I want you to think about the soldiers and what they faced when they came home and what their perceptions of the movement to bring them home may have been. The people who did not experience what they experienced, the trauma that they had experienced during the war, feeling as though potentially some feeling as though they had been abandoned by their communities and also by their government. We've talked a lot about this domino effect, and it proves to be, true here. After the failed negotiations and bombing campaigns, there's a final peace that is reached on January 27th of 1975. The promise of peace does help Nixon politically. Cambodia will fall to the Khmer Rouge. North Vietnam, which is a communist regime, North Vietnam will invade South Vietnam successfully. Ford is denied funds, and by the way, we'll talk about Nixon and Watergate. Nixon is no longer president in 1975 because he has resigned in disgrace. His vice president, Henry Ford, is now president. Congress says, no, we're not giving you any more money to help the South Vietnamese, and so Saigon will fall. After the fall of Saigon, Laos becomes communist. So all of Indochina essentially falls to communism. What is the legacy of the Vietnam War? Significant loss of life. A serious and shameful neglect of veterans after returning home. And a reluctance, Americans, we don't like to say we lost the Vietnam War. Increasingly, people seem to be more comfortable saying we didn't win the Vietnam War. But no one will say we lost, people don't like to say we lost the Vietnam War. Even it makes me feel uncomfortable because I was never taught that growing up. But if you look at what the objective was, to keep South Vietnam from becoming communist, did South Vietnam become communist? Yes. Did we withdraw troops before that happened? Yes, we did. Did we lose the war? I'll let you decide. In 1973, Congress passes the War Powers Act, which essentially tries to regulate a little bit more what a president can do in terms of committing more and more and more troops without coming to Congress first. And it does lead to an increased cynicism and skepticism on the part of the American people toward their government. Are we being told the whole truth? Can we trust what they say? Are we always going to win? Even if we're powerful, it doesn't guarantee victory. And again, I want to emphasize the way Vietnam veterans are treated and expected even to behave when they come home is something that I personally feel is a lasting and shameful legacy of this time period and of the war itself. More than 58,000 soldiers die serving their country in Vietnam. Another 300,000 are wounded. And although figures are not exact, the Vietnamese death toll is likely over 2 million. Peace, however, did not mean the end of pain and hardship. The end of the war created other problems for Southeast Asia, and it also impacted American attitudes toward world affairs. Look at the Vietnamese civilian number down there in the box, sort of middle right. It's wild. It's because the war is fought on their soil. The communist Khmer Rouge, so this is in Cambodia, come to power, and they commit genocide against anyone who's a non-communist. They relocate people out of cities and move them into rural areas where they have to farm. Many of them starve to death that way, millions of people. This is just an incredibly infinitesimal portion of the remains of victims of the Khmer Rouge. What's the impact of the war on the U.S. economy? This is 1968. Inflation, 4%. Income taxes increased by 10% because you got to fund the war. GDP is increased 9.5%, devoted to the war effort. The Great Society, remember, Johnson is successful with some of his programs, but others are weakened because he didn't have the money to pay for those programs because instead he was paying for the war. And then economic problems of the mid-1970s. Unemployment rises from 4% to 9.5% in just 5 years. Inflation reaches 10%. There's an oil embargo in 1973. Again, this is a communist, Soviet Union versus United States fight that's going on in the Middle East. Creates a severe shortage of gas, and prices soar from 40 cents a gallon, which can you even imagine, in 1973 to $1.20 by 1980. And then in 1970, total government spending was $321.8 billion, but by 1975, spending has risen to $550.5 billion. Thanks, guys.